Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia Online. My name is Marjorie Weingarten, and I'm the daughter of the late Ellis Wachs, in whose memory this endowed lecture has been named. This evening's program is made possible only through support from caring individuals like you. We hope you will consider making a gift of whatever you're able and helping the Free Library advance literacy, guide learning, and inspire curiosity for all Philadelphians. It's my sincere privilege to introduce Kate Masur this evening, a noted professor of history at Northwestern University. Her area of interest and expertise is United States in the 19th century, with a primary focus on how Americans grappled with questions of race and equality after the abolition of slavery in both the North and the South. Her latest book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction, is a groundbreaking history of the movement for equal rights that courageously battled racist laws and institutions, Northern and Southern. In the decades before the Civil War, the antebellum movement she so vividly describes in this book laid the foundation for a racial justice tradition that remains vital to this day. As Publishers Weekly has noted, she tells this complex story in lucid prose that brings out the drama of charged racial politics while insightfully analyzing the era's tortured constitutional theorizing about states' rights and Black citizenship. We look forward to her talk tonight that will be a conversation with award-winning broadcaster and journalist Tracey Matisak. We're so pleased to have them here with us this evening. Kate and Tracey, the screen is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being with us this evening. And Kate, we are honored that we are among the first to be able to talk with you about your new book. So congratulations on completing it. And thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me here. Thank you to the Free Library of Philadelphia. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you.
Well, your book is fascinating, and I, for one, learned a great deal. I want to start off with, I think, one of the things that was most surprising to me, which was that the so-called free states, where slavery was outlawed in the period leading up to the Civil War, were not as free as we might have thought, particularly as it relates to Black people. Can you talk about what was happening and why that was?
Yeah, so one thing that people are often not aware of is that particularly in the Midwest, and in the book, I spend a fair amount of time talking about Ohio and other places in the Midwest, especially Illinois and Indiana. These places were, along with Michigan and Wisconsin, part of what's called the Old Northwest, or the Northwest Territory. And Ohio was the first state to come into the Union out of that big chunk of territory. And when Ohio came into the Union in 1803, the state legislature began passing laws that were explicitly discriminatory against African Americans. So before that, Congress had outlawed slavery throughout the Northwest Territory. It was a place where actually slavery was already practiced by the French and the British back in the 17th and 18th centuries. But when Congress began to organize the Northwest Territory, they outlawed slavery. But that didn't mean, and this is really important, that did not mean that state legislatures couldn't pass laws that discriminated against free Black people. And so Ohio led the way, starting in 1804 and then 1807, passing these laws that were really designed to discourage Black migration, primarily north over the Ohio River from neighboring states like Virginia and Kentucky. And these laws required African-American residents to register with county officials, basically to show free papers and register their names, usually to have landowners post bonds promising that the African-American person in question would not become a public charge. The laws also forbade African-Americans from testifying in court cases involving white people. And these had particularly terrible and unjust consequences, because it meant that if a white person tried to rip you off in a labor contract, or if you got beaten up, you could not personally provide testimony against that person or on behalf of a friend in a court of law. And eventually, as those states formed public school systems, their public schools were for white people only, for white children only. And in addition to that, those states also, usually by state constitution, didn't permit Black men to vote. They said the vote was for white men only. So these states, and again, primarily Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, passed these laws that were, again, designed to discourage African Americans from migrating into the state and really make their lives difficult and precarious once they were there. Yeah. That's not to say that in other places like Pennsylvania and places further to the Northeast, there weren't also some racially discriminatory laws, but the Midwestern states really kind of set a pattern in a particularly kind of egregious way.
And one of the big themes of the book is states' rights and how that was really sort of the prevailing way of thinking at the time. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that complicated the effort to win civil rights for Black people?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a way that I think might feel really unfamiliar to us today, at that time, what we would consider to be civil rights or people's basic rights to things like to freedom, to enter into contracts, to go to court, to protect our interests, to own property, all of these things were regulated at the state level and the local level. And there was really no constitutional mechanism for federal oversight. So a lot of people immediately, when we start talking about rights, a lot of people go in their mind to the Bill of Rights, right? Well, what about all those rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights? Well, from the beginning of the United States, the prevailing view was that all of those rights, like the right to assemble, to petition, to due process of law, to, even to carry or, own a weapon, all of those were considered rights that the federal government could not infringe, but they were totally infringible by the states. And so the states had so much latitude to say, for example, some states said, we're going to legalize slavery, right? We know that. Some states said, we're going to have certain laws that regulate free African Americans. States could decide at what age you could vote, at what age you would go from being a minor to being an adult, whether married women could own property. All of these things were adjudicated and decided at the state level. And there wasn't really a sense that the federal government had any role in that whatsoever. And so it really depended. And we can think of examples similar to this now. It really depended where, if you were somebody who was not a white man, let's put it that way, it really depended where you lived, what rights you would have, in what state and in what kind of community.
And so was that why activists turned to the Privileges and Immunities Clause in the Constitution to try to sort of chip away at that?
Right, exactly. So in the US, as we're talking about, like in the United States Constitution, if you're in the state and you think that, your state government has these laws that are discriminating against you in various ways, you can't usually make an appeal to the federal government. Who can you try to get to promise you that you can have some rights to travel freely, to go to court? And so in some instances, and this had particularly to do with interstate issues, people looked at a different part of the Constitution, and that was the Privileges and Immunities Clause. So for those of you with your pocket constitutions out there, it's in Article 4, Section 2, and Article 4 is a part of the Constitution that deals a lot with interstate issues and kind of how to deal. You set up a form of government that has a lot of power belongs to the state. So then you have to think about how do you adjudicate and deal with issues where people or goods are traveling across state lines. And so the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which is in Article 4, Section 2, says the citizens of the states are entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens of the several states. And I mean, I didn't just give a direct quote of it, but if it sounded confusing, it's partly because it really is confusing language, and it refers to this thing called state citizenship. And then it says that if you're a citizen of a state, you have certain privileges and immunities in other states. And so a lot of what's going on in the period from the American Revolution to the Civil War, there are a lot of discussions about what this means for anybody. And it has a lot to do with commerce, actually, of whether, let's say, a white male business owner can transact business in one state if he's actually from another state, and questions like that that have to do with kind of commerce. But in the case of African Americans, it becomes a very serious question about whether Black citizens of a state have the right to travel to other states and be free and have certain rights of other states. And this becomes a hot button issue at a bunch of different times over the period from about the 1820s all the way to the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I can give some examples of that if you want.
Sure.
So the most kind of significant and poignant way that this comes up is if you think about Massachusetts and New York in particular, and to some extent it was an issue in Philadelphia, but we don't see quite as much kind of agitation around this issue as you do in Boston and New York City. So these Atlantic seaboard states have a lot of free Black sailors sailing out of those ports. And they're working in a variety of different types of sailing industry, including the interstate kind of commerce along the Atlantic coast. And so you have Black sailors, let's say primarily from New York and Massachusetts, who end up on their ships putting into ports in places like Charleston and New Orleans because they're in the industry that's picking up goods in those places, shipping them back to New York or Boston, sometimes taking them across the Atlantic, bringing stuff back. But South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, ultimately all of the slaveholding states passed laws directly saying that free Black sailors coming into Southern ports had to either spend their time in port in jail. They had to basically be arrested and go to jail, or they had to be kind of quarantined on their ships. They couldn't come ashore, or at best, they could come ashore, but they were always vulnerable to being asked by white people and police or just regular everyday people, let me see your papers, show me that you're free. There was all kinds of abuse of this. So if a Black man who's a sailor is in, let's say, New Orleans, and he says, here's my papers, I'm free, I'm a citizen of Massachusetts, authorities could say, oh, tear up your papers, and like, what papers? I didn't see any, and cart the person off to jail. And then those jailed sailors, if nobody came and picked them up, could be literally sold into slavery and never really heard from again. And so what ends up happening in Massachusetts in particular is people get galvanized by these stories. So some Black sailors manage to get out of these jails and they come home to Massachusetts and they start telling people, this is what's going on there. It's an issue that ship captains care about because it's really bad for their business if they're having to always deal with sailors getting arrested. And eventually, and so back to the Privileges and Immunities Clause, what they start claiming that Black sailors and their allies in Massachusetts and New York is their rights as citizens of their home state are being violated by these arrests and incarcerations in these southern states. So they say, let's look at the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the US Constitution. It says the citizens of the states are entitled to privileges and immunities of the other states. You can't just restrict our liberty when we're in southern ports because we are citizens of our home state. And in reality, especially in Massachusetts and New York, those states officially did recognize Black people as citizens. Their legislatures explicitly recognized that, and their governors made an effort whenever they could to try to get people out of these southern jails. And so eventually, in that instance, people from Massachusetts and the state legislature ends up saying to Congress, do something, right? Like there are all these constitutional violations going on. Do something to stop South Carolina and Louisiana and these places from doing this to our citizens. And this gets kind of brought up in the House of Representatives. And they basically, in the House, there are a number of congressmen who are sympathetic to this argument, but they say, you know what, Congress doesn't have the power. We can't do anything because we don't see how we have even the power to enforce the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And that gives you a sense of the kind of impasse that existed in a way in this period.
Yeah, and yet eventually, Kate, as you write, Massachusetts did pass legislation that allowed the governor to be able to, free up funds and all of that. So there was a point where the tide began to turn.
Absolutely. The thing that happens is this movement to try to protect the rights of Black sailors in Massachusetts gets enough traction in the state that they do everything they can at the state level. So they do, as you said, they pass legislation that allows the governor to appropriate money to get people out of these southern prisons. They publicly denounce the southern states for doing this. But then they appeal to Congress. But so they can't do anything more really than trying to secure people's freedom, denouncing it, saying it's terrible, and then appealing to Congress. There's one other thing they can do. But so they do appeal to Congress, and Congress says, some of us think you have a really good point here, but we don't see how Congress does anything to help. And their last option is file a suit in federal court and try to get the Supreme Court to rule that those laws are unconstitutional. So that becomes a whole other kind of strategy that they use, but it doesn't work.
I was fascinated because I had not known about the Black sailors until I read your book, and it reminded me of Solomon Northup, whose story was depicted in 12 Years a Slave. And I wondered, was that part of a larger effort to either to enslave free Black people or re-enslave Black people, sort of a larger effort in the country at that time?
Yeah, I mean, so and these two issues, the issue of Black sailors in southern ports, and then the issue of like kidnappers in the north, trying to grab people or exploit people or trick them into coming to the south, as was the case with Solomon Northup. They often came up together when in, let's say, abolitionist newspapers and things like that. They would talk about the dangers that free African Americans faced in both instances, whether, as a sailor or otherwise working in the South, or people coming up in these kind of kidnappers grabbing people. And either way, the kind of idea that your state government would actually care about you and try to do something to secure your freedom was relevant. And as you probably remember, like in Solomon Northup's case, after he's enslaved and basically imprisoned in Louisiana for 12 years, he finally is able to get a letter back up to New York. And if memory serves, the governor does intervene on his behalf, and they send someone to prove in Louisiana, this guy is free, he's unfairly enslaved, and he does manage to get away, but it took 12 years.
Yeah, there's so much that you've just talked about for us to unpack there. You mentioned newspapers, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the role of newspapers, because it seems that then as now, the media played a big role in shaping public opinion around the issues of the day, and certainly slavery was the huge issue of the day at that time. So how did newspapers sort of help to shape public opinion around it?
Well, newspapers did a great deal, and the early 19th century and even most of the 19th century really was a period of just tremendous flowering of newspapers of every kind. And people even now talk about remembering the days when there were many more local newspapers than there are today. But back then there were even more. I mean, tons of, small towns had newspapers. Towns and cities had multiple newspapers. Newspapers had different kinds of political views. They were very partisan. They were very political. And newspapers really shaped this conversation. And one of the points that I make in the book, I was really interested in the book in how political change actually happens. Like, how do you, if you're a person who, and I'm particularly interested in questions about racial justice, right, in this book. So if you have a kind of very progressive, but kind of marginal out there position on racial justice, and, Black people and some white allies who believe that things really need to change, but you're pushing against the majority of the white population, who are the majority of the population. How do you do it, right? How do you even begin to make inroads? And so these folks that I write about in the book, they were very self-conscious about using the media, using newspapers to get their opinions out. They also purposely would amplify controversies. So I write about the case of a guy named Gilbert Horton, who was a Black sailor who ended up incarcerated, from a citizen of the state of New York, who ended up incarcerated in Washington, D.C. And some people he knew back in New York saw the advertisement that had been placed for him in the D.C. paper saying, this guy is probably a fugitive slave, somebody should come and get him. And these New Yorkers galvanized to get him out of jail. But at the same time, they just went bananas publicizing it in their newspapers. And then the way newspapers worked even back then was they would reprint stories from other papers. And so all over the Northeast in particular, the story of Gilbert Horton and his unjust incarceration in Washington, D.C. became news, and it gave people a chance to talk about these injustices and these violations of people's rights. And he was a very, sympathetic character.
And there was also Freedom's Journal, right? The
Yeah.
Black newspaper that you write about, and sort of them walking a fine line around the issue of colonization. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I wanted to get to Black newspapers next because what's known as the first African-American run newspaper in the United States was called Freedom's Journal, and it was founded in New York City in 1827 by Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm. And they were partners in that enterprise. And then Russwurm left and Cornish took over, and Cornish proceeded to be a publisher and editor of a number of Black newspapers in that period. And one of the things that we're able to see in the development of Freedom's Journal is explicitly that Black Northerners wanted their own vehicle for getting their views out. They sometimes wanted to say things to the broader public, to one another, but also to the white public that they were not permitted to put in white paper. So there's evidence with the development of Freedom's Journal that they had some Black activists in New York, and many of them were ministers, had wanted to tell the world that they opposed colonization, which was at that time this popular idea among white people, among white Northerners, that the best thing for free African Americans would be to leave the country altogether. And this was founded in the idea, in this extreme pessimism about the idea that the United States could ever really be a biracial or multiracial nation of free people. So you have these white folks who are saying, and they act very philanthropic in this very often. They say, it will be best for everyone if free African Americans would just leave. They end up forming the colony of Liberia to be a destination. And a lot of free Black Northerners really strongly oppose this idea, and they take a stand for their own Americanness. They say that we are Americans, we are citizens, we belong here, we are entitled to kind of the fruits of this country's prosperity just as much as any other person. And you see with the formation of Freedom's Journal that Samuel Cornish and others had been kind of trying to get white papers to publish their opposition to colonization and had not been finding anybody who would be willing to do it. And that, among other reasons, I mean, also that they were using the formation of a newspaper as a tool of community building. Freedom's Journal developed representatives, kind of people who were correspondents for the paper and also would distribute the paper in cities up and down the East Coast. And so they were also using Freedom's Journal to know what other Black people were doing in other places, to kind of lift up people's voices, to spread news, and to really create a community that transcended just one place or one city. And so for all of those reasons, really, Cornish and Russwurm start Freedom's Journal in 1827. And there are a lot of examples throughout the book of African Americans starting newspapers to try to get their positions out into the world, and also, again, to kind of form communities. So there's a really wonderful one that's very short-lived in Ohio, out of Columbus, Ohio, called the Palladium of Liberty in the 1840s.
So while we're talking about colonization as part of that, we have to talk about President Lincoln, because that was something that he espoused, at least at one point. He certainly is forever known as the great emancipator, but he also was a proponent of colonization. He said at one point prior to being elected that he just couldn't see equality for Blacks and whites. So talk, if you would, about how his thinking evolved over time as it relates to race.
Well, Lincoln is really complicated, and I write a bit about Lincoln in one of the chapters. Well, I actually write about him in the chapter on the Civil War, but also in the chapter that just precedes the Civil War. So first of all, yes, Lincoln was active in the 1850s in the Illinois chapter of the Colonization Society. So this was a highly respectable among white Northerners and border staters. Henry Clay was a big leader and proponent of colonization. He was the most sort of prominent senator from Kentucky and many times over a presidential candidate. And so many leading white figures, particularly Whigs, people who associated with the Whig Party, were associated in one way or another with colonization. And it's complicated because without excusing it at all in the present day sense, they were actually sort of more, what we might call more progressive on issues of race than the people in the Democratic Party, who were much more likely to say things that were like extraordinarily white supremacist, extraordinarily kind of believed in the biological differences among races, in racial hierarchies. The Democrats tended to be extreme race baiters in their politics. And on the other hand, you have the Whigs, who are also pretty racist, but in a different and less flamboyant way. And so, you know, in a way, what they're saying, and this is the kind of guy Lincoln was, again, we don't really see how we go forward in a multiracial society. There's so much racial conflict, there's so much racism among whites, somebody like Lincoln acknowledged as well, that actually, you know, going forward, it's just beyond our imagination to imagine that this could ever really work out. And so that's kind of where Lincoln was in some ways as the Civil War started. But the other thing that's worth saying, and I think this is, I'll try to say it, you know, it seems complicated, but a lot of those people, and I would include Lincoln, also thought that as long as African Americans were here in this country, their basic civil rights should not be violated. And so you have Lincoln saying, even before he's elected president, he will say things like, everyone is entitled to the fruits of their labor. You know, nobody should be enslaved. Everyone is entitled to marry. I mean, he has a, you know, kind of famous statement about like interracial marriage, and I would never want to marry a Black woman, and that's most often quoted. But part of that statement is he thinks everyone is entitled to basic civil rights and no one should be enslaved. And so there are a number of kind of moderates on race who I write about. Some Montgomery Blair, from the kind of Blair family, they were a big political family from both Missouri and Maryland, helped out with Dred Scott's defense in the Dred Scott case and argued that Dred Scott was entitled to be considered a citizen, even though the Blairs were also associated with colonization. And so we have to kind of keep in mind these complexities about how some of these white people who were kind of middle of the road to leaning progressive for their time saw things. Yeah. But I always like to add in a kind of conversation like that first of all, it was not unthinkable to be the kind of racial egalitarian that we look for today. There are examples like William Lloyd Garrison or Wendell Phillips among white people who really believed in full racial equality. And of course, many African Americans did too, right? And so the idea that vision, a vision that's more compatible with ours today, was unthinkable back then, or that we couldn't expect people to be any different, that's not true either, right? It was fully fathomable to imagine that. It was just kind of beyond the imagination of most white Americans.
Yeah. So in 1866, Congress did pass a Civil Rights Act, and that was over the veto of President Johnson, Lincoln's successor. And it was a year to the day after the surrender at Appomattox, which I did not know. But it certainly was a big turning point for African Americans, dramatic change in the way the country now was beginning to think about equality. Tell us what that legislation provided for.
So yeah, and I got more and more appreciative of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The more I read about it, it is the first federal civil rights law. So if you're familiar with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the sort of biggest, most significant civil rights measure of the 20th century civil rights movement, you know, that is our touchstone in a way for federal civil rights law. This was the first time Congress ever passed a civil rights measure designed to mitigate racial inequality, and it happened in 1866. So this law was designed to take the country from the abolition of slavery to beginning to define what the basic rights of all free people should be. And it was passed as well, as you said, it finally passed over the president's veto in April of 1866, but it first passed Congress a bit earlier than that, in the winter of 1866. And so this was, just to kind of situate people, it was after ratification of the 13th Amendment, which had abolished slavery, but it was before ratification of the 14th Amendment. And so what people in Congress are looking at is, well, all right, we've decided that we're changing the Constitution, finally, getting back to our earlier conversation, like finally giving Congress the unquestionable power to abolish slavery in the states, which it hadn't had before. So what is a post-slavery country going to look like? And to what extent are we in Congress, and this was a Republican-dominated Congress, to what extent are we going to let states continue to have as much control as they've always had over the lives of free people, right? Everyone's going to be free. And there's this moment in the summer of 1865 where there's a meeting of abolitionists, and Frederick Douglass was there, not surprisingly, and William Lloyd Garrison and many others. And Garrison, this famous white abolitionist, says, well, the 13th Amendment is about to be ratified, and so our work here is done. And Frederick Douglass says, no, it is not, because all we have to do is look at Ohio and Illinois and Indiana to see that just because you abolish slavery doesn't mean you get rid of racist laws. And he goes on to describe this history of the struggle that I really am writing about in the book, of, the Northern fight against racist state laws, and says, if we don't push Congress to act further, then we're going to be stuck with the same old in the Southern states, and probably the Northern states too. And so we have to have some level of federal authority for the first time that sets a baseline of civil rights beyond just saying there can't be slavery anymore.
Yeah, and it certainly turned out to be prophetic in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
The legislation was also noteworthy for what it did not include. What was not in that legislation?
Well, one of the things that so one of the things about discussing civil rights is that there's always a question of what is included in that term. And there are certain things I think people agree on in the 19th century about what is civil rights. And there are things we've alluded to, the right to enter into contracts, to sue and be sued, to go to court, and to personal liberty, meaning to be able to travel from place to place. What else beyond that was included in the term civil rights was very much up for debate. So at that time, most people didn't think that the right to vote was a civil right. They thought the right to vote was really important, but they didn't necessarily categorize it as a civil right. So when the Civil Rights Act passed in 1866, it says, basically the way it's phrased is, all citizens of every race or color have all the same rights to contract, court, sue and be sued, blah, 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 as white citizens do. And it enumerates a number of things that everyone should have the same right as white citizens should have. But it's not clear, for example, whether public accommodations are included in that. So it certainly says you can't say, it's going to imply that the state can't say, Black people, it also includes criminal law. So the state can't say the punishment for Black people for stealing is $5, a $5 fine, but for white people, it's a $3 fine. That's off limits now. You can't have these kind of explicitly racist laws, but can you have, if you're a railroad company, can you have a car for Black passengers and a separate car for white passengers? If you're a theater in Ohio or Baltimore, do you have to admit Black patrons to the same sections of seating as white patrons? Technically, from a legal perspective, when you buy a ticket somewhere, that's a contract, right? You exchange money and you get the promise of something in return. So it was arguable that outlawing racial discrimination in contracting meant that everybody had to be able to have access to the same kind of contract. But it was not clear that that was going to be a winning argument. And so right after the Civil Rights Act passes, African Americans in a variety of different places all over the country, South and North, start to test the law. and they go to theaters, they get on railroads, and they make the argument that all of those places really should be included in their civil rights. These two should be places where they have civil rights. And how that shakes out is complicated. In the end, though, it's Congress decides, and really led by Black activists again, and by Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, that they're going to pass another Civil Rights Act, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1875, that explicitly outlaws racial discrimination in those types of spaces, theaters, railroads, and stuff like that. So they eventually decide that really to secure those rights, they're going to need yet another federal civil rights law. Part of the sad, tragic part of the story is that quickly in 1883, the Supreme Court declares that second Civil Rights Act, the 1875 one, unconstitutional.
So, Kate, we have lots of questions stacked up from our audience, but quickly, before we get to them, I was just thinking as I read your book and as I was listening to you just now, thinking that here we are, you know, in 2021, and we're still fighting a lot of these battles. I mean, I'm thinking right now about, you know, voter suppression and, you know, efforts to try to, you know, address that, gerrymandering and so forth. And so just interested on your take on the fact that here we are, you know, 2021, and we're still fighting some of the same battles.
Yeah, it is. I feel like I go back and forth between, and really just my response to this is, it's both horribly demoralizing, but also heartening in a way, because I mean, the way that I frame this is we are still grappling with the legacies of slavery, right? And if you think about it like that there were 250 years of slavery in this country, and it was an institution that was horrendously violent, backed by huge amounts of power, tremendously powerful in this country, right? And then you know, the northern states got a head start in getting rid of it, but we can see from the book, right, how hard it was to then reconcile themselves to some, you know, what we would see as like a pretty minimal version of racial equality. And then you have the full, you know, huge abolition of slavery in the southern states in the course of the Civil War. You know, this is a long-term project. And I think it's just like looking at the way to not be completely demoralized and feel like it is never ending is to just think about the magnitude of the damage and the kind of institutional entrenchment of that damage. And then it feels more like, well, it's no wonder it's taking so long. And we're not where we always have been. Things have changed, right? And not, I don't want to say always for the better, but there is, you know, there are more protections for rights. We are not living in the same racial situation as we were in 1865 or 1890. And yet you're absolutely right that a lot of the fights feel so similar. And even a lot of the arguments people make, for instance, about, you know, voter fraud, right, is so familiar from Reconstruction, when people who wanted to disenfranchise Black voters said, oh, well, it's not really about race, it's just about trying to protect against fraud, right? And so some of it is just incredibly familiar, but maybe knowing that it's familiar and that people keep going back to the same well is also empowering for us now.
Well, we have lots of questions from our audience. So we'll start off with one from Brenda, who asks if you would please talk about the role of Philadelphia and specifically Quakers during this time.
Sure. So the book jumps around a bit from place to place, because as we've been talking about, the struggle looked different in places like Massachusetts as compared to Ohio. So I wanted to capture that breadth. And the place where Philadelphia really comes in, as the question kind of alludes to, is in the late 18th century, when Philadelphia has this incredibly vibrant Black community. We see the foundation of the AME Church and this kind of blossoming of African-American institutions, and white Quakers who are there also promoting these ideas about freedom and equality. I was interested to find that some of the networks that I was interested in were operative in Philadelphia. So as if you know Philadelphia history, you probably already know this, but a group of African Americans from North Carolina end up in Philadelphia because their Quaker enslavers in the American Revolutionary period freed them. And then the state of North Carolina was trying to re-enslave them. And so they migrated north to Philadelphia to get away from that. Why Philadelphia? Because of the Quaker connections. And so you have this really vibrant kind of world in Philadelphia. And I write a bit about James Forten and his protest against what would have been Black laws in the state of Pennsylvania. So as these Black laws are spreading from Ohio to Illinois to Indiana, as these territories are becoming states, it's kind of like a trend to introduce in your state legislature racially restrictive laws like the ones the Midwestern states had. And this trend comes to Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania legislature starts to consider a law like that would have done similar things to what they did in Ohio. And James Forten and Philadelphia's Black and white abolitionist community, but James Forten is really at the forefront of protesting that. And that's where his really famous pamphlet, Letters from a Man of Color, comes from. And if you know Philadelphia history, you're going to be familiar with that because it's one of the earlier kind of writings from James Forten that we have. And it's lengthy and it's just kind of a remarkable document. But I thought it was really interesting to see it in the context of the spread of these anti-Black laws. And his pamphlet, which was originally published in newspapers, getting back to the newspapers, originally published as a series in a newspaper, really illustrates both what's wrong morally with racist laws, why it's immoral to make distinctions based on race, and also the practical negative consequences on African Americans if these laws are passed. And he talks about corrupt officials will try to take advantage of us. These laws will incite white people to violence because they'll see us as people who are vulnerable and people who really don't matter. And so it's really this kind of amazing exposition, the earliest thorough exposition I found from an African-American person explaining exactly why these laws are both wrong and also really damaging.
Yeah. Well, Robert has a follow-up to that. There's several questions here, so I'll read it and you can go where you like. What were the sources of the racially discriminatory laws in the northern states? Was it sympathy with slavery, born of white supremacist ideology, historical practice? Wait a minute, question just jumped on me. Economic advantage over African-American employees or something else? Did the laws pass on a surge of wide popular support for them? Or as today, did the laws pass without much ado because the voting population, white men, was indifferent to them? And also, can you make any generalizations about where the established churches were on the matter of these racially discriminatory laws? So there's a lot going on in those questions, but I'll let you take it where you like.
And those are great questions. I would say that, of the list of reasons why states adopted these laws, so first of all, they were closely fought. So for example, Ohio, when they made the Constitution in 1803, it was proposed to actually put those type of racially discriminatory provisions in the Constitution itself, in the state constitution. And that was shot down, right? And so, but they do have the voting for white people only, white men only, but they shoot down all of these kind of laws that they later pass. And then the laws passed first in 1804, the Black laws passed first in 1804 and then in 1807. And I think we don't know that much about the legislative debates about those laws, but they never were completely unopposed, right? And so you always find some pushback. In the Ohio legislature in the 18 teens, there was a little bit of a push to repeal them. And so why did people want them? My sense is the sort of prevailing view was, and this is why these laws were so much more significant in Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, the states that border on the Ohio River, as compared to Wisconsin or Michigan. I won't go into that, but whatever, it has another story. They were much more prevalent in those lower Midwest states. They really didn't, these people who supported the laws wanted to stem the tide of Black migration out of the South. So they wanted to telegraph with those laws that African Americans were not welcome. Why were they not welcome? It was a combination of let's just put like the racial part is like this kind of belief that we are a white country or we are a white community and Black people don't really fit in. And if they're around, they can't really be fully vested members of the community. They also dressed up, they sometimes talked about economic competition with whites. They sometimes talked about Black criminality and the kind of supposed negative impact of Black migrants on white communities and white youth. And then the other thing, which I do pay a fair amount of attention to because it really struck me, they fit their arguments against Black migration into these longstanding ideas about the poor in general. So the United States and in a legal tradition inherited from Great Britain what are called poor laws, and these ideas that if you're a poor and itinerant person, and going back to England where it wasn't about race, just poor and itinerant people did not have the same rights as generally free people had. They could be removed from communities. And this was all about fear of people being dependent on public resources. And so when you get to a place like Ohio, they have their poor laws, and then they actually overlay the anti-Black laws on the poor laws, and they're administered by the same people, the overseers of the poor, the same officials. And so some of the discourse about Black migration is also about like fear of the poor. They will be poor, they will be dependent. We don't really want them around because it will be a drain on public resources. And if some of this language, you know, sounds familiar to you now, it really is because it is, right? It's familiar in the ways that people have long maligned African Americans in this country in ways that have to do with poverty. And it also is familiar to some of the ways that people immigrant sort of rhetoric has been in the last, 5 or more years, which is to say immigrants who come to this country are, a drain on economic resources and so on. So there's a lot of kind of through lines in all that.
Yeah. A couple of questions here. I'm going to combine them regarding reparations. Helene says, what are your thoughts about the reparations enacted just this week in the city of Evanston that provide some redress for the historical discrimination in housing? Helene says she grew up and went to high school in Evanston. And also, Joan wants to know, do you think that African Americans should receive reparations? So we'll roll those into one and you can take it from there.
So Evanston became the first municipality in the United States to adopt a reparations program, and then last week officially decided how to distribute the funds that are coming in through a particular tax on actually legalized marijuana. So like weed was legalized, and then the city decided that a portion of the taxes taken in by the dispensary are going to go to reparations. Excuse me, and then it was decided that by a committee formed by the city government that the reparations would kind of connect to housing discrimination. I can't remember the exact dates, but basically in the era of redlining, so between the 1930s and the 1960s. I think the entire thing is, bottom line, I think it's a wonderful, great thing for a community to try to do and to try to sort out how to do it. There's been controversy in Evanston among African Americans about how the best way to do it. And toward the end of when the decision was about to be made, there were people organizing to say that they didn't want it to be associated with home ownership. So the benefit at this point is you can apply to get the reparations benefit if you're a homeowner or to help purchase a home. But the people who don't already own homes or are on the verge of purchasing one aren't eligible. And so there was pushback about this plan saying that it should be open to a broader swath of the community, that it should be cash payments as opposed to help with a mortgage or help with home repairs. And I think, in a way, but they went through with the plan anyway. And I think in a way, what that debate illustrates is the complexity of trying to figure out how to do it in practice. And that's a complexity that the whole country is going to have to wrestle with as well, if we ever truly do. But I don't think that arguing that reparations is complicated is a reason to not do it. I think actually it's when you make a commitment that something needs to be done to repair past damages that you begin to have more concrete and productive conversations about the best way to do it. And they are not irresolvable. I mean, probably a situation where everyone's happy is never going to happen. But I think, people in my circles, people are often saying how once you really take the full measure of the history of this country, you have to come to the position that people were robbed, people had their livelihoods and their lives and their families stolen from them. And you have to, from a moral standpoint, come to grips with that and figure out something to do with that. And that's where I think we kind of need to start. And that's why history, knowing history is really important.
Greg says, I love this focus on the first civil rights movement. Can you speak more about the years making up this first movement? When did the first civil rights movement end in your reading and give way to the second? And is the Jim Crow era post-Plessy decision still part of this first movement?
That's a great question. I framed this study, it goes from the Revolution to Reconstruction. And I kind of see this as like a phase. And so it can be divided into sub-phases too, but it's a phase where you get the founding of the United States, and then you get, the growth of a larger and larger free Black population because of states abolishing slavery and manumissions during the American Revolution and things like that. So all of these questions arise that people are grappling with after the American Revolution into the 19th century about what is the post-slavery order going to look like? Because we were in a post-slavery order in some places, just not in others. Why that phase comes to an end with the Civil War and Reconstruction is that this movement actually got a lot of what it wanted in the Civil War and Reconstruction. I mean, when you think about the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th and 15th Amendments, you have on the national stage, in ways that people could have never predicted in the 1840s or the 1850s, you have a win for what they wanted in terms of making explicitly racially discriminatory laws unconstitutional, right? So I think, we could safely say that marks the end of a certain phase in this struggle. And that where the struggle is going to have to pick up again is first trying to get enforcement of those Reconstruction measures, right? Which is, I guess, what happens during Jim Crow. And then by the 1950s and 60s, moving forward to a new regime of equality before the law that is much more comprehensive than anything that was even really dreamed of in the 19th century.
Question from Catherine, who says that she wants to know if your previous research in DC led to this current book, and also congratulations on the great review in the Wall Street Journal.
Well, thank you so much. One of my origin stories for this project has to do with my first book, which was on Washington, DC, and it started out as my doctoral dissertation. So that book is about the Civil War and Reconstruction in Washington, DC. And part of the point of writing about Washington is it was a laboratory for experimentation by Congress, because Congress has exclusive jurisdiction over the District of Columbia. It's not a state, as you know, if you're following the news right now. And so you can see DC as a kind of example for what Congress would have wanted to do in this period if it had had control everywhere, exclusive control everywhere in the states, which it did not. And I'm finishing up that book, and I was writing the introduction, and I was sort of writing the part where it says, so the Republicans in Congress had this vision of racial equality, a certain kind of vision of racial equality. And of course they were going to try to implement in DC. And that's where this story picks up in like 1861. And then I thought to myself, well, where did they even get that idea of equality? Like how is it that a bunch of white men Republicans in Congress in 1861 are poised to do things like not only abolish slavery in DC, but get rid of the Black codes in DC and implement racial equality before the law and create public schools for Black children. And then I thought, well, somebody's written about that, right? Like surely there's a book that explains how you get to the point where the Republicans in 1861 are thinking about these things. And there wasn't like a book that I could cite. And so it wasn't that much of a linear story, but really like this book is in some ways answering that question.
Yeah. Kate, there was so much that I learned from your book, and I know that our audience will as well. What surprised you the most from the research that you did as you put this book together?
Well, I have to say that the whole story about Black sailors, I didn't know that was going to be a story in the book. I thought everything that I was going to be writing about was going to be about sort of state level struggles in different states. And then I happened to be in Massachusetts, and I I went to the Massachusetts State Archives. I was just looking for, I don't know what I was looking for, petitions or just to see what was there. And there was all this stuff about activists petitioning and pressing the state legislature on behalf of the rights of free Black sailors. I kind of knew the story about the Negro Seaman Acts is what they're called. The laws themselves and these kind of oppressive Southern state laws were known to historians and have been written about by historians, most recently in a good book by a historian named Michael Shepner. So we know that about these kind of oppressive laws and Southern white people's fears of free Black sailors. But what hadn't really been documented was this really fascinating, successful movement in Massachusetts to change the course of the state legislature. And then all these other things started to appear, like, well, they're talking about the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and they're trying to get Congress involved. And wait, here it is again in the records of Congress. And so that whole, which takes up about a chapter and a half in the book, and then it comes back, turns out when they're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1866, people in Congress are talking about those issues of Black sailors and the Massachusetts campaigns. And so it really is a thread throughout the period that I didn't know I was going to find. And it was really fun to keep finding those connections.
Yeah, well, and it was fascinating for us as well, for all of us, I'm sure, who will be reading and enjoying your book. Kate Masur, thank you so much for writing this book and sharing these insights with us. It's called Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. You have taught us so much through this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. And
well,
thanks
and I also
for
want to
questions.
And thanks to our audience for all the great questions, for being with us tonight and participating in this great conversation. I want to thank Margie Weingarten and her family for their support of the Free Library, Laura and Andy and Jason from the author events team. Thanks to all of them for bringing all of us together. Hope everyone has a good night. Please stay safe, have a good night, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.